Welcome to the lecture. If there's an empty chair near you, would you raise your hand and one finger, two fingers, however many empty seats there might be, see if people can file in. One right here in the front row. There's one here. Oh, she's going for it. Thank you. I warn my students in my class not to sit on the front row because I spit when I talk, but there's enough room there. You don't have to worry tonight. Really, we want to welcome you. This is a wonderful honor for Dr. Sorensen and all the work that he's done through the years. My name is Paul Hoskison, and I'm the director of the Laura F. Willis Center for Book of Mormon Studies. We're grateful to the Willis family for their support of Book of Mormon Studies and for all the encouragement that they give us. The Laura F. Willis Center is part of the Neil A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship. And on the table outside the door out there, as you pass, you saw some of our publications that have come out. I have a stack here. Some of them we give away, and some of them you have to purchase. There's a little pamphlet about the Institute itself that is free, you can pick up. We have copies of past talks. The biennial talk previous to this was by Terrell Givens, Joseph Smith's American Bible, Radicalizing the Familiar. Those are also free out there as long as they last. And the Neil Maxwell Institute also sponsors lectures. Last year was by Mark Willis and Marilyn Arnold also, the Book of Mormon Passport to Discipleship to All the World, Reinventing the Church's Media Business. We're happy that we could sponsor those. Our little Insights newsletter, if there's any of them left, are free out there also. We have 3 journals that we produce. You're welcome to look at those copies, and the Joseph Smith the Joseph Smith translation. It has copies of all of the text and PDFs of all of the images of the Bible that Joseph Smith used. That's fairly new. It was out this year, I think. The Messiah documentary, wonderful documentary, and the latest book, The Tree of Life, a collection of essays on the Tree of Life, and the Book of the Dead belonging to Tsemin, and I can't say this, John Gee. Anyway, it's all about the Joseph Smith papyri. That and the textual history of the Book of Abraham, if you're interested in that kind of stuff. Anyway, that's all by way of introducing who we are and what we do here at the university. Many years ago, I had the wonderful experience of meeting Brother Sorensen, 30 years ago, in fact, this year, when he and I and some others, along with John Welch, worked at the beginnings of what is called farms in those days. It's been a wonderful association for me, and I'm glad to be here to honor our good brother, Dr. John Sorensen. We're going to start with an opening prayer by Matt Roper, after which John Clark, a colleague of Brother Sorensen's, will introduce Brother Sorensen, and after that, Brother Sorensen has spoken to us. John Hilton will offer our closing prayer. So, Matt.
Our Father in heaven, we're grateful to be here today, sharing in a desire to increase our understanding and learning. We're grateful for the privilege and blessing to be able to meet on this campus, to have the opportunities and blessings that we have. We ask that thou wilt please bless our speaker, please bless John as he presents his presentation, that he may be able to do so in a manner that as he desires to and which would be pleasing unto thee. We ask that thou wilt bless us as an audience, that we might be attentive and increase our desire to understand and exercise our faith, to increase our knowledge concerning the things that will be presented. We ask for these things, and that thy Spirit may accompany us all, in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
I'm told they're bringing in some seats for those who were a little late getting here because we were at the dinner honoring John Sorensen. So if there's anyone who wants to come up, and they'll be empty in a few, there'll be some empty ones afterwards too for those who want to come up. But Dan and others, do you want to come up and take your seat? Anyone else? Let me get this out of your way, John. Oh, you did. Thank you.
Looks like the last will be first here. Get the best seats in the house. We're here to listen to John Sorensen talk about the Book of Mormon, but you have to endure me first. I'm pleased that the Maxwell Institute honors John tonight and is allowing me to say a few things about him, some of which may be news to him. I became of John Sorensen when I heard his talk in 1975 at BYU about the New World Archaeological Foundation, or NWAF, on the occasion of its 20-year anniversary. I think my first face-to-face meeting was in 1978 when John sat in on my master's thesis defense to fill in for two committee members who couldn't bother to show up. I did not have the opportunity to take any classes from John, but I've been the beneficiary of many conversations with him over the years before he moved off campus. I've tried to keep up with his research, and I've recommended his Book of Mormon geography and cultural reconstructions as the best there are. I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say about Mormon sources. But before I sit down, I need to fulfill a promise to Paul Hoskisson and give a brief introduction to John Sorensen for those of you who have only heard parts of the legend. In light of the theme of this evening, I deem it appropriate to pry into Sorensen's influences as they pertain to his Book of Mormon research. For purposes of concision, I borrow from movie versions of his life. Here we see a young Jimmy Stewart playing John Sorensen, a.k.a. George Bailey. My task of introducing John Sorensen is a microcosm of Mormon's challenge, to condense a wealth of material into an abbreviated narrative that hits highlights and includes relevant lessons for life. If I had an hour, I could make a good go of it, but I limit myself to 17 images in an effort to avoid repeating John's experiences at his mission farewell. His brother spoke for 35 minutes and left only 3 minutes for the newly married and departing missionary, by then an ordained 70, to testify. John's story is not quite a log cabin rags to riches narrative, but he did come from humble beginnings and learned pioneer virtues. Working hard in school was a value instilled in him by his 5 siblings. He had the Sorensen reputation for scholastic achievement to uphold. Like the young George Bailey shown here, John was fascinated by geography, and he spent a lot of time reading the books available in the local Carnegie Library. John's interest in geography runs deep, initially sparked by reading the Deseret News as a young boy. Said he, the Deseret News had a series of syndicated insets called something like Know Your World. They had these little boxes with a small map and a couple of pictures. I clipped those and referred to them, and I could have been happy as a geographer. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, John joined the Army Air Corps as soon as he turned 18. Much of his time in the service was spent in school training to be a weather forecaster. The training in the hard sciences, especially at Caltech, served him well. It greatly enhanced his analytical skills and opened subsequent opportunities. After leaving the service, John decided to go on a mission, and he financed it with money he saved during the war. A felicitous set of circumstances led to his marriage in the Salt Lake Temple 6 weeks before he shipped out to New Zealand. His firstborn son was already talking and walking by the time he got back from the Cook Islands. The missionary experience was intense and gave John a practical introduction to anthropology and linguistics. The account of his days on Rarotonga make fascinating reading. He used an old translation of the Bible to learn Rarotonga Maori and eventually to translate basic LDS pamphlets into that language. You'll have to ask John about his espionage on the side. Presumably only on P-days. After the war, John used his GI benefits to attend BYU and major in archaeology. He read the only book on the topic he could find in the library, A Study of Archaeology by Walter Taylor. The archaeology department in those days was 3 years old and had one faculty person, M. Wells Jakeman. This was not the kind of subversive book Jakeman would ever have recommended, and reading it probably got John off course as far as Jakeman was concerned. John did not waste time in earning his 2 BYU degrees and 1 from Caltech. It is important to acknowledge that John was familiar with Jakeman's brand of Book of Mormon archaeology and his specific theories concerning the location of Book of Mormon lands. Jakeman's approach did not resonate with Sorensen. He had some of Jakeman's first classes. I was around to attend Jakeman's last classes a generation later. My first exposure to Book of Mormon archaeology and geography came from Jakeman. In retrospect, this exposure set me up to appreciate Sorensen's proposals years later when I first heard them. Another experience we share across the generation gap is the NWAF. John was one of 2 BYU students on the Maiden Project in 1953. John's NWAF experience was formative in many ways and served him well. Among other things, he met Thomas Stewart Ferguson, the lawyer dynamo who started the NWAF, and years earlier had been instrumental in getting the archaeology started at BYU. John became familiar with Ferguson's approach and proposals and decided there was a better way. You see here the copy Ferguson sent of his book to the great Harvard anthropologist Clyde Cluckham, which Cluckham later passed on to his student Walter Taylor, the archaeologist whose book started Sorensen down the path of legitimate archaeology. Sorensen has written so much on anthropology in the Book of Mormon that one easily forgets he sweated out a long season in southern Mexico in 1953. He excavated a monster trench at the late classic site of Tierra Nueva in Tabasco. 2 points of this experience are relevant. First, John knows about fieldwork at a personal dirt-eating level. Second, he used his spare time in the field to scrutinize the Book of Mormon. One fruit of his study was an hypothesis concerning the location of Book of Mormon lands. Near the end of the 1953 season, Sorensen persuaded Ferguson to help him survey farther upriver in the middle of the state of Chiapas. They visited 75 sites in 10 days and recorded information for many others. John described his research in the first publication of the NWAF. John's work was fundamental in relocating the NWAF's efforts the following season. Just last month in Mexico, I had the pleasant surprise of finding some of Sorensen's collections from sites visited in 1953. And I'll study them when I go back. I'll read one of his recollections from that time. Quote, I told Ferguson that I didn't think we were even close to Zarahemla, that in 4 months in Tabasco I had come to a different interpretation of the geography that I had worked out on the scene in long discussions with Gareth Lowe. Reading the Book of Mormon intensely, I had come up with a view I still hold, that the land of Zarahemla was the great central depression of the state of Chiapas. Our Grijalva River ran through it way upstream. We were down toward the mouth of the river. So I said, no archaeologist has been in my candidate area. No one knows what's up there. Let's go see. After his archaeology work in southern Mexico, John taught at BYU as an instructor for a few years before going to UCLA for his doctorate. He began his PhD program in archaeology, but his advisor died the first year. It's terrible when that happens. So John switched to anthropology so he could maintain his National Science Foundation pre-doctoral fellowship. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if John had earned his doctorate in archaeology instead of anthropology. In the period before going to UCLA, John began in earnest the type of research we know him for, explorations of the cultural worlds of the Book of Mormon. In his view, getting the geography right is merely the first necessary step to place Book of Mormon peoples in their setting. Proving the Book of Mormon true through physical evidence is not our job. The point is to consider evidence from the right place and time to understand better the people of the Book of Mormon. Here we see a pair of early papers, one a scholarly report of Sorensen's research in Mexico, and the other a proposal for the proper method for researching the Book of Mormon. I just reread the 1959 piece, What Archaeology Can and Cannot Do for the Book of Mormon, and found it current and apropos. I wish would-be Book of Mormon geographers would internalize and apply its principles. Let's skip forward through many hard years of having and raising children and trying to make a living in house payments and pick up the narrative near the end of John's formal academic career, once he had come back to BYU for the third and final time. This is just before farms really got started. John Sorensen's views were published in the Ensign just after he had his life-altering heart attack in 1984. By this time, John was working full throttle on his magnum opus he will highlight this evening. He decided to devote his energies to understanding the Book of Mormon and to help us understand it along with him. Let's fast forward even more to last month. Here I show an email sent to Dan Peterson about a potentially damaging podcast interview with Dr. Michael Coe about limitations of Book of Mormon archaeology. In his interview, Coe estimates that over 99% of the claims in the Book of Mormon are false or falsifiable. Coe certainly has earned a right to his opinion, but why anybody would be swayed by his probability prognostications of Book of Mormon evidences are beyond me. As you can see in the series of emails, Sorensen responded that his forthcoming book handles the issues raised by his friend Michael Coe. Sorensen's manuscript has been around for at least 3 years, so the only thing hindering the needed strong response to Coe's arguments is someone's editorial policy and practices. I have been in touch with Coe about his interview and its potential effect on Mormons. As part of our exchanges, Coe just sent me the high praise for Sorensen's work on transoceanic diffusion that you see here. What you should take away from reading these emails is the concrete fact that John Sorensen is known and respected as a scholar outside of Happy Valley. The point is made more forcefully in this statement by his friend Mark Leone, one of the major theorists in American archaeology. I met Leone in 1997. It soon came up that I was a Mormon, at which point he told me that Sorensen would be the salvation of Mormonism. I was theologically stunned, but in conversation I got the message. What Leone and his secular colleagues find incredible is that a hyper-competent polymath such as John Sorensen could believe the Joseph Smith story and be a faithful Mormon. I told Leone, but he surely knew this already, that the LDS Church has many intelligent and informed believers, many of which I'm looking at right now. Still, John is exceptional. There is no one like him, nor ever likely to be. We have the privilege tonight to hear from this Mormon original. The more research I do, the greater my appreciation for John's range, depth, insight, tenacity, and work. A series of happy accidents has influenced the path taken at each decision point of his life and have led him to his current place. John is especially well prepared to understand Book of Mormon peoples, returning to It's a Wonderful Life theme and the movie's message. John has lived a full and useful life. Without question, he has made a lasting positive impact on the world. Specifically, our Mormon world would have been a different place without his contributions. John's life and work should motivate us all. And now, let's hear from the man himself.
Thank you, John. Some of that I did not know. Some of it I knew and had forgotten about, and I'm just as glad that I had forgotten. John has indicated that thank you. Has indicated that I might be relating to you something connected with my forthcoming book, my last book. One writes a last book, no matter what the order, one after another. I'm not prepared to summarize that book. It's an 800-page book, and I don't think I could do justice to it tonight. But I want to do what I've done before, to start, to go back. Much of what I've done has really been to start scholarship on the Book of Mormon, not to finish it. I've tried to invite and implore others to take up the task that I've been interested in. Not that anyone cares to listen to me, but I hope that they may find an interest in pursuing what I have been pursuing, which is to learn more about the book itself, the Book of Mormon, including its context. What I'm talking about tonight is quite a different thing. Well, it's different in that it's another basic introduction to the Book of Mormon. I'm going to talk about Mormon sources in the sense that whatever Mormon did in writing the Book of Mormon, he had to depend on sources. He didn't remember the history of the Nephites. He hadn't inherited traditions that he was trying to write down for the first time. He said that he abridged the library of his people. Now, to my paper. When Mormon saw that his Nephite people were about to be exterminated around AD 380, he set out to write a small abridgment of the title of the tribe's records. By the way, all the written version of this will have the full documentation in Book of Mormon terms, but I'm not going to try to replicate that here. This project of Mormons began at the last location where the Nephites camped before they finally gathered to the land of Cumorah. The subsistence conditions of the Nephites that the Nephites were enduring could not have been anything but harsh. The people were refugees many times over, with uncertain sources of food, clothing, and shelter. Mormons' writing activity probably extended into the 4-year period of preparation for the final battle, agreed to by the Lamanite commander. But in any case, the abridged history was completed, and the archive was buried in the hill Cumorah well before the final conflict. Consider some of the limitations Mormon faced in realizing his aim. First, the size of his new record would have to be severely restricted. The account was to be passed on to his son Moroni, who alone would survive the Nephite genocide, and the book had to be portable enough that Moroni could carry it to a safe location. Second, the physical product must be prepared to endure for centuries, and the only suitable technology available at that time called for the use of thin metal sheets compiled in book form. Third, of the possible writing systems Mormon could use, only one was concise enough to allow the prepared history to fit on the planned artifact. That was the traditional Reformed Egyptian script with which the ancient plates of brass brought from the land of Israel had been written, as well as later Nephite sacred records. The fourth point is, he must severely discipline his editorial hand so as to construct a narrative of practical length that was faithful to the facts of history related in the archival records he was summarizing, and that would be phrased in a manner he considered appropriate. Fifth, the work schedule was short. Mormon may have thought he would have only a year to do the writing. It turned out that he had a little more than 3. He may not have had time even to read through all the archival records in his hands, and there surely was no time for stylistic fine-tuning and re-editing of his account. Given all these constraints, how did Mormon choose what information to include and what, we can suppose reluctantly, to omit? He tells us that he depended primarily on the writings of the large plates of Nephi to formulate his narrative, but they were a huge record covering more than 600 years of history. He still had many decisions to make, obviously. The fundamental format of the plates of Nephi was that of annals. Annals are yearly summaries of salient events. This format is clearly reflected at many points in the Book of Mormon. For example, in Helaman 6:15, where we read, "And it came to pass that in the 60th year of the reign of the judges, behold, Caesorum was murdered by an unknown hand as he sat upon the judgment seat. And it came to pass that in the same year that his son, who had been appointed by the people in his stead, was also murdered. And thus ended the 66th year." That is how Mormon chose to summarize the record for that year. Generally, these annalistic entries were succinct. As an example, Mormon's record for the 26 years documented in Helaman chapters 2 through 6 averaged less than 7 verses per year. The contents of 4th Nephi are still more compact. The highlights of 285 years are there covered in only 49 verses. Mormon apparently considered that short version of the history to include all he wished or needed to say concerning that period. Yet at many points he goes into considerable detail about obscure events and circumstances. A prime example is the account of the assassination of the Lamanite rebel leader Lahontai and of the Lamanite king, as told in Alma 47. It is unreasonable to think that those anomalous scenes were ever recorded in the official Nephite annals. We are not given as much as a hint of anyone who was an eyewitness of those events and who might have relayed the story to a Nephite record keeper. This presentation is concerned with where Mormon obtained the information he included in the Book of Mormon. Except for his own short eyewitness entries, he obviously relied heavily on the archival record. What other written sources did he call on? How factually limited were those sources? And on what basis did he choose materials from them for inclusion in his record? No doubt some will consider this a minor matter of questionable value. I do not. It seems to me that any light that analysis sheds on the Book of Mormon is to the good. If we discover that the materials used to construct the story were chosen or construed in particular ways by its sources and by the compiler, the reader deserves to be made aware of that fact. Mormon implies as much by his or Moroni's writing a detailed title page that acknowledges that human factors inevitably intruded into the project. If analysis shows that other influences were at work in the compiling and editing process of which even they were not fully aware, our understanding of the Book of Mormon could be increased by taking those factors into account. This study also contributes to the persistent question of the authorship of the scripture. When analysis shows that the multi-source nature of the information in the book shows that nature, our assurance is confirmed that it was written anciently, using the words of a variety of persons, and not by any one person in the 19th century. Mormon's primary source is obvious, the large the larger plates of Nephi. We will review the nature of that record and then look at other apparent sources. Finally, we will examine a sampled section of the Book of Mormon that sheds further light on our questions. The larger plates. Mormon reported, quote, "I made this record out of the plates of Nephi." The plates of Nephi, in this sense, have often been called by Latter-day Saint writers the large plates of Nephi, although the scripture itself never uses that exact phrase, only at Jacob 3 and 13, the larger plates. The plates on which this master record was written were crafted by Nephi not long after arrival in the American Promised Land, around 11 or 12 years after the group's departure from Jerusalem. On them, he began to engrave a record of my people, including that of his father's migrant party and their journeyings in the Arabian wilderness. Nephi likely drew this account from temporary records on papyrus that he and his father had kept before this set of metal plates was made. On the plates, he began to make, quote, a full account, unquote, of the history of his people, specifically tracking such topics as the reign of the kings and the wars and the contentions of the people he ruled. No doubt he was the originator of the annals format that became the norm for records on these plates. Subsequently, he commanded the Nephite rulers who succeeded him that the history should continue to be recorded, quote, according to the writings of the kings or those which they caused to be written. After the kings no longer ruled the Nephites, care of the historical records was shifted to a line of religious leaders. Nephi could not have anticipated how many metal plates his secular history would eventually require, so blank sheets of hammered metal must have been added periodically to his original set to accommodate the writings of later generations of historians. But the name of the record, the Plates of Nephi, was retained for the enlarged set in honor of the founder of the tradition. There is reason to believe that when successive portions of the master record were added, they were labeled the Book of so-and-so, even though they were integral parts of the Plates of Nephi. While named after the principal individual who began that section, they sometimes also included records kept by that person's descendants. For example, we are told that one portion of it draws upon the account of Alma and Helam and his son, and also Shiblon, who was his son. It seems reasonable that each of the component books represented a number of metal plates manufactured at the onset of the named scribe's tenure. Then these would have been filled up by him and his descendants, after which a new major writer would craft new plates and begin another installment of the ongoing historical record. We cannot be certain that individual writers on the key record did not use materials beyond the annals scheme in their entries. At least in one place, we learn that a lengthy record was entered on the plates. Mormon reported that he was commanded not to include in his record, quote, the more part of the things which Christ taught the people of Nephi, although they had been recorded on the Plates of Nephi. And given the great detail provided about events in certain years, Mormon clearly exercised his own discretion about what he chose to incorporate in his record. Nevertheless, the consistency and dominance of the annals format is apparent throughout his record, from Mosiah 1 to Mormon 7. Just because a source record existed, that does not mean that what was written could be understood in a straightforward manner. The Book of Mormon text reports at several points the difficulty scribes had in making their statements clear. We may suppose that similar difficulty was felt by all writers equally. So when Mormon examined the older writings, he would have faced the same problems with those imperfections. These obscurities were more than just a matter of the awkwardness of our hands, a phrase that Moroni used in Ether 12. That phrase might refer merely to the technical problem of making proper marks on the unforgiving metal. But he went on to describe the problem beyond that, saying, "We behold our weakness and stumble because of the placing of our words." Moroni implies that the writing system of the Jaredites, which he considered superior to that of the Nephites, accounted for the greater clarity. Thus, it appears that the script system the Nephite writers were using was itself part of the problem of the lack of clarity. Since Mormon continued with the same writing system with which Nephi began the record, his writing would have suffered the same disabilities. He said, "There are many things which, according to our language, we are not able to write at all." Our language, in this sense, obviously refers to their writing system, not to their spoken tongue. Moroni further tells us that these linguistic difficulties would not have occurred had they used the Hebrew script, an alphabetic system, to keep their records. In that case, there would have been no imperfection, he says. However, he further explained that using Hebrew writing as their primary medium was precluded because that would have required many more metal sheets to accommodate the same record. The imperfections the Nephite scribes reported seem clearly to have resulted from use of the particular writing system they were using to keep their sacred records. There's a portion now that I will not read, but you may read it in the printed version, about the nature of the characters which were called Reformed Egyptian. I will read, however, some portions of it. Based on the sample of characters published as the Anthon transcript, which purport to be copies of the characters from the plates Joseph translated, it is apparent that they were not modeled directly on Egyptian hieroglyphs. They look more like the signs of hieratic Egyptian, a parallel sign system related to the hieroglyphs and used by the Egyptians as an alternative to the glyphic system. I argue that, and have argued elsewhere, that this system was not something that Lehi had been taught for practical purposes. It was instead that he learned it so that he could read the brass plates. This is told to us in Mosiah chapter 1, talking about the nature of the plates. Both the hieroglyphic and hieratic systems of Egyptian were more concise than alphabetic Hebrew script. At the same time, they were inherently more ambiguous because a large majority of the characters they used represented whole complex morphemes or words called logograms by linguists, rather than the sounds spelled out to form words as in an alphabet. The meaning of each logogram had to be memorized. Moreover, some of them had multiple meanings, and Egyptian writing was notorious for its use of wordplay. John Gee goes so far as to say that these sources of ambiguity meant that, quote, sometimes even the Egyptians themselves could not read their own writing correctly, unquote. The sense intended by a particular piece of writing had to be clarified as far as possible by adding qualifying characters or by the context. It is reasonable that this ambiguity was involved in the problem of the placing of our words spoken of by Moroni. Mastery of the meaning of records kept in any Egyptian script required extensive memorizing, but a particular passage might remain problematic. Skipping some more. This situation may relate to Nephi's explanation that the scriptures on the plates of brass, quote, were hard for many of my people to understand, for they know not concerning the manner of prophesying among the Jews. Nephi knew how to read and interpret that material from his experience living at Judahite Jerusalem in an advantaged household where he studied such matters while growing up. the necessity of a major time investment in order to become thoroughly familiar with the abstruse matters that frame this, or perhaps any Nephite writing system, is confirmed in 3 Nephi chapter 6, where we are told that among the Nephites, only the rich could achieve extensive learning, presumably because of the greater leisure that they're at their disposal to master the system. Excuse me while I pour something. There was a day when there would have been a cup of water here. Failure to read a text with complete clarity might have something to do with the point made by Grant Hardy. Nephi too, he noted, exclaimed, "Oh, that I could have had my days in the day when my father Nephi first came out of the land of Jerusalem. Then were his people easy to be entreated, firm to keep the commandments of God, and slow to be led to do iniquity." But of course, that was not true. Hardy comments, quote, "It is hard not to smile at his misplaced nostalgia. Either he has been reading a very different version of early Nephite history, or he wasn't paying very much attention." Possibly Nephi, too, was confused by the difficulty of reading the old text clearly. An additional cause of imperfections, the Nephite writer reported, could have been that since hieratic Egyptian was mainly used to write cursively, its use to engrave a record on the medium of metal plates could mean that minor slips of a writer's hand could result in misreadings of the characters without an effective eraser at hand to make corrections. An even more serious problem for an accurate history would have been the fact that the Nephite annal keepers at tribal headquarters lacked, as far as we can tell, any social apparatus for obtaining information about events taking place outside the capital. Their accounts could well have omitted information we would like to have seen included. It is very unlikely there was such an institution as a system of messengers in use, nor was there any press they could consult. So they must have been led to rely to a considerable extent on casual reports, and no doubt rumors, about salient events mediated to them by merchants or itinerant travelers. A glimpse of the problem of this ad hoc reporting that it imposed on Nephite scribes is seen in the case of Helaman's report in Alma 56-58 of events that had taken place in his sector in the war against the Lamanites. His lengthy letter was the only news Commander Moroni I, received of matters on that front in approximately 4 years. When Helaman periodically pled for more men and supplies to reinforce his beleaguered forces in messages to authorities in Zarahemla, what he said was never communicated to the chief commander. Probably neither did his reports ever reach whoever was in charge of the annals at that time. At least the larger plates of Nephi seem not to have included any record of Helaman's operations. If such loose handling of the report of a vital military action was the case, it is even more likely that communications of lesser urgency would have been treated offhandedly. Other sources. Supplementary documents were used at certain points in creating Mormon's narrative. As noted earlier, accounts prepared by earlier writers existed in the Nephite library under their own name, either as books that were part of the comprehensive larger plates of Nephi, or plates of Nephi, or as standalone documents. Mormons sometimes referred to these sources and then several citations are given. These references leave unclear whether the records referred to were on physically separate plates or whether they were merely sections in the expanding plates of Nephi. The second option appears likely in the case of 4th Nephi, where verse 19 says that Nephi the fourth kept this last record upon the plates of Nephi. Sometimes Mormon also depended on other original writings that appear to be behind or beyond the annals, some of which he did not distinctly identify. Some cases where information from supplementary records were seemingly of this sort are, first, the text of King Benjamin's Great Discourse. That is so long and detailed that it is very unlikely to fit into the format of the plates of Nephi. Again, the record on the plates of Zeniff, with the account found in Mosiah chapters 9 through 22. Alma's first-person preaching at Zarahemla, Gideon, and Melech, quoted in Alma 5 and 7 through 8. The story of Alma's and Amulek's experiences at Ammonihah in Alma 9 through 14. The detailed account of the ministry of the sons of Mosiah and their companions among the Lamanites in the land of Nephi and thereabouts, given to us in Alma 17 through 26. Alma's discourses to his sons Helaman, Shiblon, and Corianton in Alma 36 through 42, and Moroni's translation and abstract of Ether's history of the Jaredites. At times, the Mormon sources provided some mysteriously detailed information. We are left to infer that he had the advantage of writings by unacknowledged participants whose records are very unlikely to have found a place on the plates of Nephi. Obvious examples are the stories, as noted above, of the assassination of both the Lamanite rebel leader Lahontai and the Lamanite king, and related events in Alma 47. A particularly strange point of interest is the experience of the Nephite multitude with the risen Savior, as recorded in 3 Nephi 19. As his disciples were rapt in prayer to him, he made statements to them that presumably they did not consciously perceive, yet the account records his words. How were they documented? At yet other times, Mormon appears to make historical inferences on the basis of quite general information. An instance is the sweeping assertion that, quote, there was not a living soul among all the people of the Nephites who did doubt in the least the words of all the holy prophets who had spoken. I am sure that he could not have had documentary evidence of any such thing. Mormon could only have guessed that, and he could have only guessed that Jacob III, that is the rebel ruler, seeing that their enemies were more numerous than they, he being the king of the band, therefore he commanded his people that they should take their flight into the northernmost part of the land, and there build up unto themselves a kingdom until they were joined by dissenters, and they became sufficiently strong to contend with the tribes of the people. It is safe to suppose that no one would have left such a record in the Nephite archive. Even in these cases where we can identify written sources for what Mormon wrote, the question remains, how did the original scribes obtain their information, and how reliable were their facts? In many cases, obviously, they reported what they personally had observed. That mode of reporting is especially visible in the Book of Omni from the smaller plates, where only a barely discernible thread of history shows through. A serious historiographic issue would have arisen in the keeping of the tribal history as the Nephite population grew and society became more varied and more urbanized. The primary historians dwelt in the city of Zarahemla or some other major center. Did they have access to systematic, reliable reports of events taking place at a distance? They give no indication that they did. it is obvious that whatever they learned about events away from their own bailiwick must have been restricted. Moreover, that which was recorded in the annals on the large plates of Nephi must always have included a filtering, subjective interpretation by the scribes of what was deemed important to record. A minor kind of mistake is of the sort that every historian and writer encounters at times, whether they come from a poor memory or errors caused by errant hands, the equivalent of modern typos. No writer could avoid a certain number of slips of the stylus. They may be among the faults alluded to by Moroni on the title page that are the mistakes of men. They include the erroneous report of the capture of the city of Nephite, and a mistake where the same event is said in one passage in Alma 56 to have taken place in the 26th year of the Judges, but in Alma 53, the same event was supposed to have been in the 28th year. Such flaws show the human side of the historian's task, although they need not cause us any serious problem in reading the account. The record Mormon wrote, "The key sacred records were kept on metal to ensure their permanence. Accounts kept on more perishable substance would, they assumed, become unreadable over time. Metal plates were not easy to manufacture, so they were in limited supply. Drawing on the varied written materials available to him, Mormon composed his history, quote, according to the knowledge and the understanding which God had given him. Divine assistance was sometimes directly and specifically, as in the case where the Lord instructed him not to include a lengthier treatment of the teachings of Jesus to the Nephites, but no indication is given that additional historical information was revealed to him. The process of his becoming an historian had its beginnings, of course, when he was 10 years old and living in the Nephite land northward. He was approached at that time by Ameron, the last previous custodian of the Nephite archive. Amid growing unrighteousness among his people, that old man had buried up all the records in his possession. He charged youthful Mormon that when he reached the age of 24, he should go to the designated records cache and recover from it the larger plates of Nephi, and then add to it what his recollection was of events over the 14-year period. Mormon said several times that his abridgment could not treat more than a fraction of the historical material found on the large plates of Nephi. How then did he make his selection of materials among the records he set out to abridge? His primary criterion comes through repeatedly in his book. The aim was to ensure that his readers, especially the future inhabitants of the American Promised Land, and particularly Lehi's descendants, grasp the significance for them of the promise and prophecy given to Father Lehi, which was, quote, inasmuch as ye will keep my commandments, ye shall prosper in the land. Actually, it was Omni's negative version of Lehi's dictum, to which Mormon gives prime attention. Quote, inasmuch as ye will not keep my commandments, ye shall not prosper in the land. Even the long sections on warfare emphasize that theme. Overwhelmingly, Mormon's writings depict the Nephites poised on the edge of destruction due to their failure to meet the conditions of Lehi's law of survival. He uses little of his narrative to describe people's happiness and prosperity. In particular, we have only the very briefest description of the circumstances of the people during the period after the coming of Christ among them. And the reason is because he was not concerned to describe their happiness, but to make the point that failure to keep the commandments would lead to unhappiness. How objective how objectively factual were the reports by the original scribes? In many cases, obviously, they put down what they had directly observed. But our experience tells us that different people see the same event or situation in quite different ways. Mormon himself certainly colored some of his reporting with personal interpretation. This stance is often signaled by use of a phrase like, "and thus we see." Similarly, what was recorded in the annals would inevitably have included to some degree a filtering, subjective interpretation of what was deemed important for the scribe to record. I cannot conveniently present to you the sample of sources which will be given fully in the printed version. To examine an actual portion of the text displays more clearly than a general discussion how complex was Mormon's use of ultimate and intermediate sources. Table 1 lays out 27 factual assertions included in the record between Helaman 1 and 3, with my suggestions of the sources Mormon relied on for each. My interpretation in this table of possible sources may, of course, be an error. It may be that some of the record keepers wrote much more detail on the large plates about certain incidents than seemed generally to have been the case, but there's no direct evidence for such exceptionalism, and we could still not explain how the factual information reached the analyst. It seems to me more likely that where lengthy, specific details are included in the narrative, that Mormon must have supplemented the primary record by seeking out further facts from one detailed source or another in his archive. I suspect that in some cases his personal curiosity was so piqued, say in regard to the assassination of the Lamanite king by Amalickiah's gang, that he was motivated to search out the rest of the story. Now a summary on Mormon sources. 1. Mormon's editing activity was carried out under limitations of time and conditions that were at best highly inconvenient for writing history. 2. He was forced to rely on the official archive of his people for his data. The basic source for his narrative was the plates of Nephi. 3rd, that was an open-ended master historical record consisting of successive entries engraved by official scribes on metal plates. Major subdivisions consisted of books named after primary record keepers that were added throughout Nephite history. 4th, apparently all the Nephite historical documents in Mormon's possession were written in a script derived from Egyptian hieratic. The nature of this system was such that scribes encountered difficulty in expressing clearly some information and perhaps in reading earlier records with complete assurance. 5th, the fundamental format of the master record was annals, yearly summaries of the most salient events known to the record keepers at the chief Nephite centers. 6th, the ultimate sources and authors of information processed into this annals format are unspecified. The relevant facts seem to have been assembled by the analysts only in an unsystematic and probably a subjective manner. 7, some of Mormon's material beyond that in the annals likely came from extended writings of the primary earlier record keepers, which they interlaced with their annal entries. 8, still other records or documents were also kept in varying detail, at times on different metal plates. A large number were accumulated in the Nephite record collection that Mormon possessed. The Lamanites, incidentally, only occasionally kept written records, but had no archive that was mentioned by the Nephite scribes. 11, or some other number. Rarely, short periods of history were written up by the scribes from their personal recollection. possibly with the aid of records kept on perishable materials. And that, incidentally, raised the question whether Mormon was so rash as to write his original composition of the Book of Mormon on the metal plates directly, or did he have a previous version, a version on temporary writing materials that he used to correct. That would have been quite daring to just put down the record flat out on the metal. Mormon acted as far more than an editor in compiling his account. He included comments that interpreted the significance of his materials and filled in gaps in his data with observations about general social and historical dimensions and trends as he understood them. At no point is there reason to think that Mormon manufactured any history. All indications are that what he wrote was based on documentary sources available to him. A few indications remain that certain pieces of data he used have no sources that can be identified. It is clear that the creation of the Book of Mormon was a complicated business. Consider the pressure of time on Mormon throughout the steps he had to follow. First, he had to manufacture the plates he would use. Then he had to read through the larger set of plates. He had to conceptualize the structure of his volume. Then decide what core information he would include. Then he could seek out supplementary data from the archives on events of particular concern. He had then to compose the text in the light of the interpretive framework he had decided to impose on the contents, and finally, to engrave the account on the plates. The combination of all of those tasks was a daunting feat, especially given the field conditions in which he had to work and his competing duties in commanding his forces as they prepared for the final battle. That he did not find occasion to clarify exactly how he proceeded in his editing or abridgment is not surprising. In some ways, his inspired accomplishment in producing the Book of Mormon was just as surprising and admirable as Joseph Smith's later achievement in translating the record in such a short order. And of course, Mormon did not compose using the Urim and Thummim. Mormon and Moroni present their brief record to their future readers as a unique kind of interpretative history. They convert it on the ages to come, not as an historian's history, but as a powerful moral message intended to school readers in the lessons the two men had learned in long, arduous service to their people and to their God. They used the best sources they had available in the most efficacious way they knew how. The labor and dedication their work displays have been for our gain and for those of their descendants. They have my profound thanks. Thank you.